Fourth Sunday of Epiphany, January 29th, 2023. Our gospel reading is from 5 Matthew, the Beatitudes. When Jesus saw that the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And that's the gospel reading for the fourth Sunday of Epiphany. Well, when we think about the Beatitudes, it is central to what Jesus has taught us, his sayings. It's a central saying of his life, of his ministry. The Sermon on the Mount itself covers chapter 5, 6, and 7. It's really a continuous read, although it's clear probably from the context that Jesus said these things in a variety of different ways, different places, and different times, but they all really cohere as a subject. Matthew was nothing if he wasn't a good teacher, and he brings together all that. Those things that are similar, using many of the same sayings. Some of them can be almost like Buddhist koans, something you can really think about. The Beatitudes themselves are paradoxical. They don't seem quite like they fit into reality very well. They just, blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted. Well, okay, in time they will be comforted, in at least to the extent that they have a normal grieving process where they can let go of whatever it is they're grieving about. But they're not comforted in the midst of grief necessarily. They can be comforted maybe by the idea of eternal life, but that isn't, I think, what Jesus really means here. If we think about it in an external way, the Beatitudes don't make a lot of sense. They seem very much to clash with reality. If we think, however, in an internal sense, the Beatitudes can almost be a ladder of inner experience of spiritual growth. It begins, the ladder, the first step is humility. Most every religious group that I've ever heard has some sayings that are really against the human ego. And humility is that point at which one realizes that one can't really do it without God in their life. that's what humility does for us. It can come out of a trauma, it can come out of a setback, it can come out of even just life not quite going the way you'd hope it would. Nevertheless, humility is the start of that inner ladder, the first rung, if you will. Now, after one is humbled and begins to absorb that experiential teaching, one begins to look around and see that there are lots of other people who have experienced humility as well. And that is, well, if you're thinking of, in terms of specific Beatitudes, the first one is really, blessed are the pure in spirit. The experience of humility purifies one's understanding. So blessed are the pure in spirit when they experience humility. And then blessed are those who mourn describes, in a way, the next rung on the ladder, which is to look around and see that the world is filled with suffering and people who grieve. Now, through time, the arrogance of that experience, experiencing humility, and when we're young especially, we have a good deal of arrogance. And I was thinking about it. I came of age really well, or at least in my college years, when I began to function more as an adult. I very much liked the messages of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in general. Even wasn't terribly put off by the Panthers. Thought they were asserting rights that seemed sort of normal for most of us to assert. Nevertheless, what I'm saying is that as a young person, I was looking at the world and I was saying, oh, look at that, look at that, look at that. Racism, 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 racism. I also had feelings about that in terms of the Vietnam War. I thought it was a misanthropic war, although I did eventually participate in it. Nevertheless, what I'm saying is, as a young person, I was pretty arrogant about my way. As I'm looking out on the period we're going through now, the wokeness of this particular period, I see in a number of young people the sort of judgmental, arrogant nature of being woke. Well, I'm glad they're woke, but they need to let go of the arrogance to understand that they've gone through a process to become woke, and they need to let other people have their process, whatever it may be. That really covers the blessed are the meek. When you begin to let go of the arrogance of one's position, I would say, as it's presented sometimes publicly, the arrogance of the evangelical theological position. It's not bad theology, for the most part, but it's certainly bad experiential living to judge from that point. When you're saying, well, this is the way and the only way, well, That's arrogance. And what it needs is meekness. So blessed are the meek is the letting go of that arrogance. And then one begins, when one lets go of the arrogance, one begins to work actively about justice and holiness and the oppressed and disenfranchised people, rather than condemning and judging people and saying, oh my gosh, Lincoln was a racist. Lincoln was fairly appropriate for the time he lived in. He didn't have a lot of choice in that matter. He grew up when he grew up. Nevertheless, it's arrogant to look back and say, oh, well, we shouldn't name a school after Lincoln because he was a racist. No. As a racist, he evolved out of that position and emancipated the slaves, among other things that he did. So, blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness. After letting go of the arrogance and beginning to work in the areas of justice and peace and after a while, after you get to a certain age, you begin to think about other people more than you think of yourself. That's, I think, sort of a natural spiritual thing. And when that happens, you're beginning to follow, blessed are the merciful. You see that life is not all that easy, and you give people a lot more credit for their own lives. You give them mercy in the face of their weakness and their problems. You also push against them somewhat. And in that process of first being humbled and then looking around and seeing what's going on in the world, and then letting go of one's arrogance, and then beginning to work on peace and justice issues, and then beginning to see others as important or more important than oneself, that process leads us to blessed are the pure in heart. The heart has been purified by humility, by the ebbing away of arrogance, by the looking around and letting go of the judgment involved. And finally, as one goes out in the world and begins to work on those things, peace and justice in particular, resistance happens. It's no longer about what you think of me. I'm not worried about what you think of me. I'm beginning to do in the world what I think the world needs. And one receives resistance for that. That really brings us to blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. It's true. That's a ladder. Humility, ebbing of arrogance, looking around and seeing that other people are in the same boat. Letting go of that arrogance, dealing with meekness of oneself. And when one begins to think of others more than oneself, and of course then as one begins to be active in the world and receives resistance for it, one might be persecuted or experience resistance anyway. So that's the Beatitudes. Much, to me, much more sensible to think of it as a ladder within one's life rather than just these paradoxes that seem somehow impossible goals. They're not impossible. They're just internal. And they bless us by that internal experience. And they produce the fruits of the Spirit: gentleness, kindness, mercy, peace, justice. Well, that's the sermon for this particular Sunday. Take care. Have a good week.